Hey, welcome everyone to the Nova Baha'i Center Sunday morning program. The program is going to be recorded. If you do not want to appear in the recording, please click on the stop video icon at the bottom of your screen. If you just move down to the bottom of your screen, a strip will pop up where you can mute yourself or stop the video. After the talk, we will be taking questions. You can click in the participant box, click by your name and raise your hand, or you may enter a question in the chat box and we will read it for the speaker. You can do it publicly, or you can send it to me privately and I will read the question to the speaker. We are now going to begin the program with an opening video prayer.
Oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants, and reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law. Help them
Our speaker this morning is Mr. Masud Olufani. Mr. Olufani is an Atlanta-based actor, mixed media artist, and writer whose studio practice is rooted in the discipline of sculpture. He is a graduate of Morehouse College and the Savannah College of Art and Design, where he earned a Master of Fine Arts in Sculpture in 2013. He has exhibited his work in group and solo shows nationally and internationally. He is the creative director of Blocked, a global healing project, a multimedia performance created to memorialize spaces marked by the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade. As an actor, he has had a recurring role on the BET series The Quad and has appeared in numerous television shows, including Greenleaf, Being Mary Jane, Devious Minds, Satisfaction, and Nashville. He is a featured actor in the film biopic All Eyes on Me. Mr. Olufani's topic this morning is the stony and glorious path towards oneness. So we are now going to turn this over to Mr. Olufani.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to be with you all. And, normally I have this routine on Sundays where I get up and I have my copy of the New York Times and I'm watching Sunday morning news. And then I decide at some point that I actually want to get up and do something. And it's wonderful to have, this opportunity to share with you, which motivates me to really get fully invested in the day and beginning it with a conversation which I hope will be spiritually based and grounded and in some ways maybe enlightening for us all. Recently I was in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, which some of you may or may not have been to before, but it's a city with this rich and varied history. I was there for the installation of an exhibition that I am having currently at the Rosa Parks Museum in downtown Montgomery. And in the middle of installing the exhibition, I decided that I wanted to take a walk one day and kind of discover the city. It's something that I quite often do whenever I'm in new spaces. I like to walk. Maybe that has something to do with me growing up in New York City, a part of my life, and walking the streets of the city and discovering new things. So I decided to take a walk, and as I was maneuvering through the city, which right now in this moment is for the most part shut down because of COVID-19, of course. So I pretty much had free reign to walk the streets unencumbered and without crowds or having to negotiate my way through clusters of people. And I stumbled upon a fountain that is in the heart of the city. Beautiful fountain made of wrought iron, and has this kind of circular architectural space around it that frames it. It sits in the middle of a roundabout, so cars are constantly zipping around it to go to streets that kind of intersect at this space. And I noticed that there was a plaque at the location that talked about the history of this space. And it turns out that in the mid-1800s, this fountain was the site of slave auctions for the city of Montgomery. And in light of the protest and the civil unrest that is going on, some of the city's artists had painted Black Lives Matter around the base of the fountain. So you had this kind of intersectionality of the before life of this space and the present life of this space. And it got me thinking. And then I looked across the street. I was going across the street after I'd spent some time at the fountain. There was a coffee shop there, and I wanted to go and get myself some coffee. So I walked to this coffee shop that was just across the street from the fountain. And as I was making my way back towards the museum to continue my work, I noticed that just across the street from the fountain, facing it, was this statue of Rosa Parks herself. And it turns out that at that location, that's where she boarded the bus oh so long ago, back in the 1950s, where she would refuse to give up her seat, which of course sparked the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. And I thought again about how symbolic and interesting this was, how you had these two historical moments occurring, kind of held in a kind of stasis, in a way, if you will, or a kind of perpetual interaction because of the way this space had been conceived and utilized. The fountain itself marking the space where an iteration of America's original sin was practiced in all of its perversity and inhumanity. And then you have the statue of Rosa Parks, indicating symbolically and also literally the beginning, in many ways, this fight for justice and mass civil disobedience on the part of African Americans, supported by some of our committed and enlightened white brothers and sisters, and a diversity of clergy and religious groups and organizations coming together to demand justice for the marginalized amongst us. And it was a moment for me of profound kind of insight and a kind of reconciliation, if you will, or reckoning with the complexity of our past and our history. And I thought about that in that moment in light of the protests that are going on, the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, the various people who have been killed violently by police, unarmed Black men and women, disproportionately murdered at the hands of some, certain officers within the police force. But not only that, I pulled back on history because, again, symbolically, I was at this intersection of these different periods of history. I pulled back on the history, the racial violence visited upon the Black body down throughout history, the lynchings, the objectification of the Black body, the commodification of the Black body, the oppression, the framing, the arresting of the Black body. And I thought about how, in many sense, the moment that we're in right now, where we are beginning to reckon with the complexity of our past, in a very real sense, is because of the historical moments that we have passed through racially in this country. And I recall that as I watched the video of Mr. Floyd being killed, and the look of indifference on the face of that spiritually sick white officer, his kind of nonchalance and his indifference to the humanity of Mr. Floyd, and how that struck me in the core of my being, how it seemed to touch on some deep-seated wounds that I had within my psyche, within my soul, from my own racialized experiences that I had as a child, from the stories that I heard from my father and my mother. And I was filled with this, as I've described it before, this deep sense of loss and sadness, whose roots felt ancient and deep, and how it seemed to rock me at the core of my being. And I was also filled with anger, a sense of despair, a sense of and for a few moments, a sense of hopelessness in a way. And so what I had to do in those moments, what I felt a desire and inner call to do, was something that had sustained me throughout my life, was something that indeed had sustained my family, indeed that's something that had sustained the Black community throughout our long and treacherous walk in this vast wonderland called America. And that was to pray. And so I found myself in those days in the wake of the brutal murder of Mr. Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and these others, praying, reflecting, thinking about notions of justice, thinking about notions of suffering, thinking about the concept of the oneness of humanity, indeed the spiritual law of the oneness of humanity, which forms the core principle of the Baha'i faith. And as I began to pray and began to reflect and to think about the Baha'i writings, the Baha'i teachings, the notion of the oneness of mankind, the inescapability of the reality of our oneness, that in some sense, in some fundamental way, we have a core identity which is spiritual in nature, and then we have these secondary identities which important and which also have social and real world complications, in particular for Black and brown people in America, but that our fundamental reality is spiritual in nature. I found that despair and that sense of hopelessness, that anger began to lift a bit. And that sense of hope and assurance in a future predicated on notions of justice, predicated on notions of fairness, predicated on the reality of our shared oneness. And then I began to reflect on what my role was in this process, what I could do in my own personal life, in my own engagement with the public, with the community, to, in some small way, help to advance this idea of our interdependence and to help to subvert the notion of our separateness, our stratification, our disunity, our disharmony. And all of my life, even as a 4-year-old child, I have been dealing with signs and symbols and metaphors and allegories. That is the language of the arts, whether or not you're a painter or a sculptor, whether or not you're an actor or even a musician or a singer or what have you, or a writer. You're dealing with an artistic language that points to something deep in the soul, that in some way provides context to the human experience and unleashes and touches something deep within the core of our being. And so I began to think about how my practice as an artist, how my engagement creatively could also help to speak to this notion of our shared oneness. I thought about my enslaved ancestors on both sides of my family. I come from enslaved Africans. My mother's people cut sugarcane on the vast plantation fields of St. Croix. My father's people picked cotton in the vast cotton fields of Central Texas. And I thought about these people doing this ungodly and inhumane work on a daily basis, and how they had to draw on reserves of spiritual capacity just to get from day to day, to get from moment to moment. I thought of the tradition of the field holler songs, how they sang to each other, how they would encourage each other through song, how they would couch intent and hide some of their plans for freedom, their desire to escape in songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd, Look to the North Star, Swing low, swing low, swing low, sweet Jesus, coming forth to carry me home. I thought about the spirituals that grew out of the field holler songs. I thought about Go Down Moses, way down to Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. I thought about how the blues comes out of that, out of the spirituals, and then jazz. And then, of course, we have the great blues and soulful traditions. And then out of that, we have hip hop music, which of course began with this really social conscious context. I remember being a child in the streets of New York City and taking the train every day for an hour and a half from my home in Far Rockaway, Queens, to go to school in Newark, New Jersey, because it was the only arts high school that would accept me at the time because I lived outside of the district. And I remember listening to some of those old hip hop songs and how beautifully poetic they were and how they seemed to capture a moment and speak to the social dysfunction that was inherent in this vast experiment we call democracy. I thought of the songs from like the Sugar Hill Gang, one of the first hip hop groups to ever be formed, and how they say broken glass everywhere, brothers peeing in the streets because they just don't care. I tried to get away, but I couldn't get far because the man with the tow truck repossessed my car. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. And then I also thought about Lauryn Hill and her poetic recitations, where she says, MCs ain't ready to take it to the Serengeti. Bomb graffiti on the tomb of Nefertiti. Take a negative and turn it into a positive picture. And I thought about these examples of constructive resilience in music. I thought about the examples of constructive resilience in artistry, people like Romare Bearden, people like Langston Hughes, who use poetry, who use language, people like Robert Hayden, who use the power of oration and language to create a way out of no way. And something in my soul, in my being, said that this is what I want to try to do, to use artistry as a way, as the Baha'i writings say, to lift us from one plane of existence to another. In the Baha'i context, Baha'u'llah says that art is a ladder to the soul. And a ladder takes us from one plane of existence to another. We can ascend from this earthly moribund, this destitute reality that sometimes seems overwhelming. And through the power of artistry and creativity, we can lift ourselves to another realm of existence that nurtures the soul, that releases us, that provides context to the complexity of our experience, that expands us, that draws connections between us as a human family. I was talking about this yesterday. One of the most profound writings that I've ever heard about the nature of humanity in literary form comes from the play Hamlet, where Shakespeare puts these words, the great bard puts these words in the mouth of Hamlet, where he is contemplating the nature of humanity. And he says, what a piece of work is a man in form and faculty, how noble, in action, how like a god, in comprehension. The paragon of worlds, the beauty of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? What to me is this quintessence of dust? And I thought about, in some sense, how Baha'u'llah answers the great bard hundreds of years later when he says, know you not why I created you all from one same substance, that no man should exalt himself above another. And then Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Perfection, goes on and he says, regard man as a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. As a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. So the bard is posing the question, he does not have the answer. Baha'u'llah comes in hundreds of years later and he says, here is the answer. You are a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. In contemplating our shared humanity in light of the civil unrest, the civil disobedience, the great convulsions across the chasm of race, the binary of the black-white divide, I thought about Martin Luther King echoing the poet John Donne when he says, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together forever in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. No man is an island unto himself, each man a piece of the continent, a part of the whole. And then he goes on towards the end to say, any man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind. Therefore never seek to know for whom that bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I thought about that stuff that knits us together, that spiritual reality that binds us, that allows me to say to my brothers in far away and distant lands, to my sisters around the corner in different neighborhoods that I don't normally visit or that I should be in more often, that regardless of the social stratifications that separate us, you are my brother and my sister. And that is not a theoretical supposition, that is a living reality, as real as life itself. And I thought the internalization of that reality and then the translating of that teaching into action through community engagement, through devotional gatherings, we can come together as a community and reflect on the teachings of the divine revelations, where we can pray together, through children's classes, where we bring young people into our homes and we help them to understand themselves as spiritual beings, through our engagement with junior youth empowerment programs, where we take young people and give them a spiritual and moral education, through study of the sacred writings, that in some sense we peel back the layers of our separation and we get to the core of our spiritual reality, and we see ultimately that we are one human family, and that no amount of racist ideology, no amount of sexism, no amount of classism can undermine that reality. It has been and remains a transcendental truth. I thought about the manifestations of God. We go back through time. Baha'u'llah, we look at Prophet Muhammad, we look at Christ, we look at Buddha, Zoroaster, so forth, Moses, Abraham, so forth and so on. How in some very real sense, these beings constitute divine physicians sent to mankind to help to educate us, help to heal the sicknesses that afflict the body politic. I thought about the corpus of humanity laying prostrate on an operating table, and these divine physicians standing around this corpus and diagnosing the ailment that afflicts the body, and then prescribing a remedy. I thought about how in this day that notion of the oneness of mankind is the core reality, is the central focus of this revelation, this divinely revealed revelation of Baha'u'llah. And I thought that in some sense that must be because we have gotten so stratified, so segregated, so separated, that God in his infinite, unknowable, immeasurable, inexhaustible wisdom is saying to humanity that in this day, the realization of your interconnectedness and your oneness is the central focus of this divinely revealed revelation. And so I found something happening in the core of my being as I contemplated, as I thought about these things, as I was wrestling with my despair, my sadness, and then as the prayer and the contemplation on the sacred writings was bringing me out of this, coupled with service, with engagement in the community, I found myself contemplating and experiencing something mystical, a kind of alchemy, if you will. How something that was discarded, something that was debased, something that constituted a kind of spiritual detritus, could be transformed through the power of prayer into something that is constructive, ennobling, and restorative. I thought about notions of truth, how the Baha'i writings say that truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues, that in some essence, the house upon which the moral character of humanity is built must be based on the spiritual reality of truth. That in some sense, we cannot affect an idea of courage, of nobility, of humility, of wisdom, of love and compassion, unless it is rooted in the reality of truth. And I thought that as the nation is grappling and wrestling with its historical past, vis-a-vis its interaction with the notion of race, with the complexity of race and of color, that in some sense, we have this sacred obligation to make sure that we ground ourselves in the truth. I thought about the spiritual designation of people of African descent as the pupil of the eye, and what that means, what that has meant for me in my journey as a Baha'i, as a Black man, again, walking through the complexity of race in this culture. I thought about the reality that light enters the eye through the pupil, and that how light in some sense is synonymous with the truth, how there is an interrelationship there. an interconnectedness that is inescapable and inevitable. And that part of my responsibility as a perfect person of African descent, part of my responsibility as someone who has been designated and honored with that appellation, with that designation of being the pupil of the eye, is to help humanity, is to help a bewildered and disillusioned America come to terms with the truth. And so, in some sense, everything that I am trying to do, everything that I am wrestling with, everything that I am trying to uncover in my practice as an artist, in my engagement as a human being with society, with my fellow brothers and sisters across the cultural spectrums, in some sense, must be about shedding light on the reality of our existence. And that reality is not just material, it is also spiritual. And so Black people, having walked through this gauntlet of racial challenges for 401 some odd years since the first slave ship arrived on these shores, in some sense, in this revelation, Baha'u'llah, the blessed perfection, the glory of God, the latest in a line of manifestations of God, is saying to Black people, because of the suffering, that in this day and age, you are blessed with a spiritual designation that has never been given to any group throughout the history of revealed religious truth. And in this day, that spiritual distinction is pupil of the eye. And I thought that since becoming a Baha'i and learning about this reality, coming to terms with it, internalizing it, how it acts as a wedge between myself and inflicted slights of racism, bigotry, and injustice. How in some sense it forms a kind of spiritual armor that allows me to move through the world with dignity, with hope, with commitment, with dedication, and with an assurance that regardless of how the world sees me, this is my spiritual designation and distinction. It is an honor of tremendous significance, but it also comes with tremendous responsibility. I thought about the brilliance about how Baha'u'llah frames, the Baha'i writings frame the interaction between Black and white, right? How he talks about in the Baha'i writings, how Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, how Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, his appointed successor, talk about the responsibilities of Blacks and whites in creating a bridge across the racial divide. I thought about how whites have to prove themselves trustworthy through their interactions with the Black community, through their fidelity to truth, to righteousness, to honor, and to justice. They have to prove themselves trustworthy, and how that is the first step. And then a corresponding effort, how Blacks have to, after that trust has been demonstrated and proved, have to also exhibit a willingness to forgive the past. In essence, what the Baha'i writings are doing, which is so profound and so brilliant, is saying that both groups have a part to play in the healing of the racial divide, a responsibility. And the parameters of that action are defined in that context, in what whites have to do and what Blacks have to do. I thought about how symbols, signs and symbols, how metaphor and allegory oftentimes frames our reality, and how that in this very moment is interacting with the complexity of our racialized history. As we see monuments that contextualize, that talk about and glorify the Confederacy are coming down, as we see murals saying Black Lives Matter being painted across the US, and how we see as there's some backlash against some of our sick white and brothers and sisters who have a difficulty realizing, or have a difficulty living with the concept that Black lives matter when for so long they have not mattered. I had someone ask me recently, what is it? What they said was, they said that they felt like the term Black Lives Matter was segregating, and that was about separation and not about unity. And then I drew back again on that concept of divine physician. When the physician is looking at the body, he doesn't usually concern himself with the parts of the body that are functioning in an effective way. He frames, foregrounds, brackets those parts of the body that need immediate address and redress. And who among us, more than the most marginalized, the most oppressed, the most brutalized, need more immediate attention than our Black and brown brothers and sisters, be they Native American, be they African American, the most marginalized amongst us. In essence, we need to triage that part of the body politic, and through the power of truth and restorative justice, bring it back to its full capabilities and healthy functioning. Art for me, creativity, has been a kind of mechanism for survival, and a way to endure the traumas, the difficulties and challenges that I had myself personally have dealt with, but also that African Americans have generally dealt with through our long walk through this land. In essence, this has been a mechanism, a kind of way to endure, to find a way over troubled waters. As the great singer Mahalia Jackson used to say, sometimes I sit back and wonder how I got over. It's been a way out of no way. It's been about survival. I had a show once here in Atlanta at the Museum of Contemporary Art. A dear white brother walked up to me and said, Masud, are you angry? Because your work to me seems to say that you are angry. And why do you focus so much on the Black experience? And what I shared with this brother, what I tried to help him to understand, was that this work that I'm doing, this process that I'm engaged in through creativity, through trying to contextualize human experience, to in some small way reveal some semblance of truth, to help people perhaps to expand their field of vision so they can see the world perhaps in a little bit different way, so that they can empathize and understand what their brothers and sisters might be dealing with and going through in a very real and deep way. What I am doing is coming out of a tradition, a long tradition that goes all the way back to those field holler songs. Even beyond that, goes back to the slave ship that was crossing the Atlantic through the Middle Passage, where Igbos, Wolofs, Ashantis, Mandingos, speaking different languages, had to find a way to communicate spiritually in a very deep way across languages in order to survive. So at first they practiced the universal language of the drum, the beat of the drum. And then on the plantation, when Master realized what they were doing through the communication of the drum, he took the drum. And then they started to take the Christian tradition, which in many senses, many of them were forced to convert to under the threat of death. And they transformed Christianity, infused it with the spirit of the African, and created something new. In essence, expression, artistry, creativity became a means and an apparatus for survival. And it is out of that tradition that I come. It is out of that tradition that we get people like Langston Hughes, that we get people like Robert Hayden, that we get people like Dizzy Gillespie, that we get people like John Coltrane, that we get people like Toni Morrison, all coming out of this lineage of constructive resilience through the mechanism, the apparatus of creativity. And so what am I ultimately saying? I'm saying I have been rocked by grief recently. I'm saying I have been sad, I've been angry. I'm saying I've been frustrated. But I'm saying ultimately that through the power of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, the teachings of the great manifestations of God, the transcendental, indomitable will of the faith of God, that despair, that anger, that sadness, that sense of hopelessness is transmuted, converted, transformed into faith, into assurance, into a determination to contribute my small part to this process of the oneness of humanity in the field of service in action. To take it out of the realm of theoretical supposition and conjecture and make it real through action, to take an inventory of my friendships, to look around and say, everybody in this circle looks like me. Maybe I need to think about extending this circle and consciously go into spaces where I might be the minority, where I might be the one of only, I might be the only one or maybe one of few, but to say that the principle of oneness, the call to the realization of our interdependence is greater than the discomfort that has to be endured to make it real. That in essence, that discomfort we have to embrace, we have to run to, we have to accept and know that it is the tax that we pay for the glory of oneness. The road is stony. The road is hard. Sometimes we trip. Sometimes we stumble. Sometimes we cut our toes. But it is our love for, our belief in, our commitment, our devotion to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, our intrinsic relationship to our Creator that keeps us going forward. In spite of the challenges, in spite of the difficulties, we use what we have. We join hands. We commit to the work. We endure the discomfort. We search out means for restorative justice to help our brothers and sisters, to give them what they are due. And to, as James Baldwin said, the great African-American writer, it is not a matter of freeing the natives. It is a matter of freeing oneself. To understand in some sense that my destiny is tied up in the destiny of my brother and my sister. That is our challenge. That is our call. And if Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Perfection, is to be believed, that is the most important of spiritual truths that we have to make real. The Baha'i writings say that racism is America's most vital and challenging issue. Vital, important, immediate. Vital also referring to taking the vital signs of the body, the health of the body. Challenging because the perversity of this spiritual disease has infected every aspect of American democracy. And that to overcome it will require all of the creativity, the love, the commitment, the perseverance, the dedication, the courage that we can muster. But lo and behold, a new world is dawning. that we can just barely now see the crest of the sun over the horizon. And as we are caught in this immediacy of these destructive forces that are tearing away at the fabric of America, we also know that there is a restoration taking place, that the destruction of what was old, that did not serve us, that continues not to serve us, but to undermine our ability to be unified and made whole, that the destruction of that clears a path for something new, a new civilization based on justice and equality, a new civilization based on fairness, a new civilization knit together by the reality of our spiritual identity, a new civilization reflective of the brilliance of our unity in our diversity. So that's what I'm thinking about today. Anyway, I'll shut up and I will turn it back over to our dear host.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, beautiful speech. I think that is one of the most incredible Baha'i talks I have ever heard. We will now open the floor up for questions. If you go down and click on your chat box, it will open up a window where you can type in your questions, and I will read the questions. You can also click on your participant block and raise your hand. I see right now we have a question from Emmanuel, so I will go ahead and let Emmanuel ask his question. I think I am trying to unmute Emmanuel, and it is not letting me do it. Can Shinichi, will you see if you can unmute him, please?
I think I'm unmuted.
You are.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Masud, for sharing, that wonderful talk, especially from the standpoint of a member of the Black community. It gives so much hope. But as Baha'is, especially those who were not born Baha'is, we always have some interesting histories, how we became Baha'i. And when listening to you, I was wondering, how did you become a Baha'i, and what has driven you to the Baha'i faith? Thank you.
Well, I've told this story many times, and you know, as I'm telling it, I sometimes find myself really moved by the details of it, not because of myself, but because of the circumstances that kind of framed that experience. But I was a student here in Atlanta at Morehouse College, an institution, historically Black college and university that was founded to educate the children of enslaved Africans. Same institution that Dr. Martin Luther King graduated from. But I was a student there, and I was seeing a young woman, a brilliant and talented theatrical student at Spelman College, which is an all-female institution across the street from Morehouse College. And at the time, I had gone on a deep spiritual search. I was reading a number of different books, the Bhagavad Gita. I was reading some of the Buddhist writings. I was reading the Bible, the Quran, the Tao Te Ching. I just was trying to find meaning in my life in a deeper way. And I had reached a point in my spiritual journey that I had made a decision to become a priest. And I was going to become an Episcopalian priest because I wanted to get married at some point. And Catholics can't get married. But the young woman I was seeing happened to have a very dear friend on campus at Spelman who was an administrator, who was a long-standing Baha'i. And she went to her one day, and she told me this story after the fact. And she said to her, you know, I'm seeing this guy. I like him. He thinks he wants to be a priest, but he's not a priest, but he might enjoy the Baha'i faith. And so she arranged for an introduction between me and her. And as soon as we met, I must say, I felt like I knew her from, like we had been friends for years. It was the first time in my life that as soon as I looked at somebody, there was a knowing, there was a deep kind of recognition between souls. I, of course, had never heard of the Baha'i faith, which is not unusual for many people who, you know, when they hear about the faith, have, you know, when they begin to investigate it, that's the first time of them hearing about it. I had never heard about the faith before, and I assumed that if I hadn't heard about it, given my extensive dive into religious history, that it must be false. So I began a systematic process of trying to prove to myself and to others that this was, you know, the wrong way. This wasn't the reality. What happened was my birthday was coming up, and this woman, Jamila Kennedy, who's a really dynamic Baha'i here in Atlanta, has been for years, gave me a prayer book. And one day I made the mistake of opening up the prayer book and reading the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I say mistake because at that point I was committed to trying to prove the validity of the Baha'i faith wrong. And when I read Baha'u'llah's writings, the feeling that I got was the same feeling that I had when I read the Quran, when I read the Bible, when I read the Bhagavad Gita. There was some core in my being that these truths were plucking in my soul, some reverberation in my spirit. So I knew that it was reality, it was truth, and I had to acknowledge it. And so that began a process of me investigating. The young woman subsequently, part of the story, which is probably important to mention, she and I had decided that we wanted to get married at some point. And then she contracted breast cancer, and she passed away 6 months after the diagnosis. She was 23, her mother's only child, and she introduced me to the Baha'i faith, even though she herself was not a Baha'i. She was the gate through which I passed in my walk towards Baha'u'llah. And for that, I am eternally grateful to her. So.
Okay, we have a comment shared in the group chat box. It says, you have shared so beautifully the lives of many figures whose inner life was spiritually led and as an example for society to learn from. What historical or current figures would you recommend young people to learn from whose life played a significant role in the spiritual heritage of African American history and descent, both Baha'i and other faith traditions?
Wow. Well, there's the low-hanging fruit. What I mean, the more obvious choices like Dr. Martin Luther King. But if you want to get in, which I encourage everybody to read about, because he was such an extraordinary human being, imperfect, flawed, but thank God for that, because so are all of we. So it makes his accomplishment and his achievement in some sense attainable, if you will. Or I'm able to see myself perhaps doing some of that given a set of similar circumstances. Nevertheless, if you want to understand Dr. King, I would encourage you to read also about Mahatma Gandhi, who was so central to King's philosophical and spiritual formulation. I would encourage you to read Howard Thurman, who was one of King's professors and mentors. And I would also encourage you to look at people like contemporary writers. Ta-Nehisi Coates does a really good job of framing the current conditions that we're living through across the black-white divide and the cracks that have formed in our consciousness. you know, there's people like, oh gosh, Isabella Wilkinson's incredible book, The Warmth of Other Suns, is an extraordinary work. I encourage people to read. I encourage you to read about Robert Hayden. A lot of people don't know Robert Hayden, the great Baha'i poet, was the first African-American poet laureate of the United States. And that was before the title poet laureate had been introduced, but all of his duties were the same as the current poet laureate. And he was such an extraordinary master of words, and the way that he talked about his faith in light of the issue of race and just human experience in general. I would encourage you to read, gosh, there's so many. Malcolm X, I encourage you to read about Malcolm X, his ability to speak truth to power, to frame in very simple terms the dilemma of race. Yeah, there are so many. Zora Neale Hurston, again, Toni Morrison. I could go on and on, but those are some of the ones that I would, that I'm thinking of that come to mind immediately. So, yeah.
Okay, now we have a question from Marissa. Marissa, you'll need to unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Am I okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Masud for the wonderful presentation. And my question is about Robert Hayden. And you mentioned it, you know, like right before, you know, I asked this question. Robert Hayden has been a favorite of mine for a long time. In that middle passage poem, he said, "You cannot stare that hatred down or chain the fear that stalks the watches and breathes unto its fetid, its scorching breath. Cannot kill the deep immortal human wish, the timeless will." Robert Hayden is a Baha'i, or was a Baha'i. And one of the questions that I had, you know, reading his poems is something that I would like to address to you. So in my mind, it takes a lot of, what was it? Not courage, but it takes a lot of, but I don't have a word for it. But people who adhere to the idea of owning other people must have that kind of psyche that lets them do that. So my question to you is, as a Baha'i, what are your thoughts in practical ways of changing the psychological aspect of racism, that people can accept, that other people can own, you know, individuals?
Oh, it's difficult. It's a difficult and complex thing to think about in some ways. Also quite simple in others. But you know, Dr. King used to say that racism was a spiritual disease. It's a spiritual sickness, and unless we heal the sickness, we will soon discover that it is a sickness unto death. And you know, I think part of this, as a person of African descent, and the spiritual distinction of being a pupil of the eye, and you know, the notion of light entering the eye and that being synonymous with truth and reality, I think we have to start there with really having this deep interaction with the experience of excavating and coming to terms with the truth, no matter how difficult, no matter how hard, no matter how unnerving. And then we have to own that truth and that reality collectively. What I mean by collectively, the responsibility for those actions are not to be are not to be shared by everyone. I mean, certainly Africans had no choice in being enslaved. The responsibility for that ghastly act was on the Europeans who decided to go into the heart of Africa and steal its sons and its daughters. So the blame for that lays on those men and women who initiated that ghastly enterprise. The system of white supremacy, which is comes out of, one would say, materialism, because it all starts there. It was all about profit. Racism is a bastard child of materialism. Racism would not exist if there was not economic gain tied to it. So racism actually comes out of the fact that white Europeans had to come up with a justifiable means to enslave their Black brothers and sisters, some way that they could live with themselves that would be justifiable and continue to feed the economic engine of the Deep South and also the North. So they invented this corrupt and ungodly notion of racism, which essentially said that there are certain groups of people in the world who are pagans, who are less than human, whose status, in a sense, is meant to be of service to others, and particularly of service to us. And so that was a way of helping them to deal with the complexity of their conscience, any guilt that they might feel about carrying these people from one part of the globe to the other. So I think we have to really reconcile with the complexity of that history. And then there is the system of white supremacy that grows out of that. Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, describes materialism as a cancerous malignancy. And he says that how it was perfected. It began in Europe, but was perfected in the North American continent, and how it had invaded the continent of Africa and spread its ominous tentacles to the borders of Africa, and now was invading its very heart. And how he described it as, precipitating the dire ordeals that must constitute the burning of cities and the spreading of consternation and terror in the hearts of men. So this system of white supremacy, the framework of which was constructed in order to support the economic engine, the materialism of the West, and then how all of everybody who existed within the country and beyond were benefiting, if they were white, from the system of white supremacy. And how, whether consciously or subconsciously, we support and reinforce that system. And so these are difficult things to come to terms with and to reconcile with and to deal with, to consider that, well, maybe nobody in my history, in my family's history, owned slaves, but how am I benefiting from the system of white supremacy? How is it serving me? And how is it not serving the marginalized amongst us? These are difficult realities to deal with and to come to terms with. But on the other hand, the other choice is to live a lie. And in some sense, to constantly have to invent ways to reinforce, to buttress that lie so that I can live with myself. In a sense, it is a kind of slow, painfully slow spiritual death. So it's a process that we have to constantly be engaged in. That we have to constantly be bringing ourselves to account each day, as the Baha'i writings say, in our conversations with one another, in the way that we talk about the issue of race, in the way that we talk about restorative justice, in the way that we talk about what restorative justice means in the light of the suffering of people of African descent and the suffering of the people of native descent. What does restorative justice look like? And then you get into something that's more complex and challenging, because you start to talk about the money. The Baha'i faith says that there is a material and a spiritual reality. And the economic disparities that exist disproportionately between blacks and whites. Average white households have a net worth of $171,000. Average black households have a net worth of $17,000. Now, there's only one or two reasons why that is. Either black people, for some reason that science has not yet revealed, are somehow genetically disproportionately, right, afflicted with some inability to manage their finances. Or, on the other hand, their experiences with racism for 401 years, the economic disparities that result from segregated housing and hiring practices, the inability to get loans from the government, redlining, convict leasing, being ostensibly freed, but yet not giving anything in which to establish your livelihood coming out of slavery. So just turned out into this vast wilderness with nothing in hand. That experience, the other choice is that that experience has had some impact on that community. So these truths and these realities require, as you said earlier, and you said it was the wrong word, but I think it was the right word, courage. There is a kind of moral courage and conviction that we have to look into the complexity of our past, into the sickness of racism, call ourselves to account, call our brothers and sisters to account, and say it's time for us to let go of this spiritual disease. If we are invested in the health and the well-being of the body politic, if we accept our shared oneness, our interdependence, we have to cut this malignancy out. The doctor doesn't play with cancer. He cuts it out. So that's, I think, is where we have to really begin, where the healing begins. It's in the truth and coming to terms with the truth. And that is a slow process. Sometimes it's quicker than others, but quite oftentimes it's slow because it's difficult for me to face areas in my life where I need to shore up or to think about whether or not I've benefited from something as a male. Have I benefited from something where a woman in the same professional circumstances is being discriminated against, but I'm benefiting it just because of my maleness? I have to look at that and then take steps to address those inequities. I hope that that in some way speaks to what you were asking. I'm not sure, but I hope so.
Yes, it did. My second question, if you don't mind me asking, is to go back to what you mentioned. You mentioned something about middle passage. I have spoken with a lot of people about, the history of racism, but some of them are not aware what the middle passage is. Just to enlighten everyone.
Well, I mean, the Middle Passage really is the journey across the Atlantic from Africa to America for enslaved Africans. It essentially is the middle leg of the journey as you're crossing the Atlantic. It also is considered to be one of the most brutal chapters or dimensions of slavery, because you have literally hundreds of people stacked in the belly of a slave ship in spoon fashion. They were organized. So the head, one person's head would be at the feet of another, and that's the way people were stacked in the slave ship without any room to kind of exercise or to stretch their legs or to stand up. They were all chained together. There were two types of slave captains or slave ship captains, as it was described. There are two methods for packing slave ships. You had what they called loose packers and you had tight packers. Loose packers believed that if you put less people inside the belly of the slave ship, you could deliver more people to port in America healthy, and you would gain more profit ultimately. Tight packers wanted to pack as many people as they could, and this was perhaps the most deadly form of, well, it's not perhaps, it was the most deadly form of packing a slave ship, because the slave ship became a breeding ground for pestilence and disease. And so you had people dying from scurvy, from smallpox, from a variety of different diseases, people losing their minds, people sleeping in their own filth. And you can imagine a journey of some months across the Atlantic during that time, and you're being ripped away from everything that you know, from your language, your culture. You're being branded as you got onto the slave ship. You're hearing the moans and the groans of women who are being violated on the deck of the slave ship by these barbarous individuals. What that must do to the mind, what that must do to the soul of the individual. So the Middle Passage is that hell through which those enslaved Africans pass through from the west coast of Africa in their long and treacherous journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas.
Thank you very much.
We have some more questions here. Someone says, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for you sharing your heart with us. Thank Baha'u'llah for you. Do you know whether Dr. King had any direct contact with the faith? Clearly, he was so inspired by its spirit.
Yeah, Dr. King knew about the Baha'i faith. That is clear. We know that he knew W.B. Du Bois, who of course was part of the Black intelligentsia and a member of the Talented Tenth, which is a group of elite Black intellectuals during the early part of the 20th century. He was a prominent figure and perhaps the leader of that group. And we know that his wife was a Baha'i. We also know that that he, that he knew Baha'is, that he had met Baha'is, and he was, in some sense, there seemed to be a mystical intercourse on the one hand between him directly knowing Baha'is, but also the spirit of oneness, which is the spirit of the age, impacting and influencing his theology and his philosophical approach to the challenges facing America. So there seemed to be something operating at the very literal material way, where he was interacting with people who were Baha'is, but then also beyond that, there seemed to be a kind of spiritual conversing with the spirit of Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Perfection, the glory of God, and the spirit of Dr. King. So, in the person of Dr. King. So there clearly there was a deep influence, both in the material plane and also in the spiritual plane, that helped to influence his approach to civil disobedience and his perspective on the interdependence of humanity.
Next question says, I'm currently listening to Stamped from the Beginning by Ibrahim X. Kendi. Have you read it?
I have not read it. I have it on my bookshelf. I've got like 10 books I need to get to. Recently, it's been a little bit hard, but it is on my reading list. So I'll be getting to it at some point. I'm reading David Blight's powerful treatment of the life of Frederick Douglass right now, which is quite wonderful.
The next question, can you please share some of your experiences in community building activities that contribute to the conversations about race?
Yeah, this is really important. Community building activities are essentially those ones that I talked about earlier, things like children's classes, junior youth empowerment programs, devotional gatherings, all of these things. The entire Baha'i world community is engaged in this process of strengthening communities. It is a way of, in essence, strengthening the world spiritually and building more cohesive, more interdependent kind of community-based realities. I do a devotional gathering every Wednesday, which is kind of an art-centered devotional gathering. And there's a kind of loose framework around what a devotional gathering is supposed to look like. And when I say loose, I mean there are some things that you can't get away from. You have to kind of, in a way, you have to join with members of the community in saying prayers and perhaps reading some sacred writings. But other than that, it can take on a shape and a kind of creative approach that is unique for community, for culture, or what have you. The main point is that you're bringing people together to really focus and center this kind of spiritual experience that strengthens connection. So I found that deeply empowering for myself, and I think also the participants who weekly join in on this process are getting some really powerful experiences as a result of their participation. So these sorts of things, which are very practical ways of extending the circle of brotherhood, of making our contribution in a very practical way to strengthening community. We are finding that where these processes take hold, communities are growing. They're becoming more interdependent. You find more of a sense of your neighbor looking out for you and you looking out for your neighbor. So in essence, you're strengthening community across cultural lines, across economic disparities, and you are, you are in some small sense, but a not insignificant sense, contributing to the realization of the oneness of mankind. And also woven into some of these processes, whether you're talking about children's classes or devotional gatherings, you can also have conversations around the issue of race in a very real and fundamental way, but infused with the divine writings, which takes it to a whole nother level. So it's not just diagnosing the problem of race, but it's looking at what is the spiritual teachings? What do the divine writings say about the reality of race? What are the divine writings? How does it diagnose? How does it define our oneness, our interconnectedness, and that becoming the bedrock for how we frame, how we think about the concept of racial stratification and how we envision these notions of oneness and interconnectedness. So those things are vitally important to the health of humanity and to our understanding of racism.
Yeah, I think we have one last question here. There's some comments, which I'm sure you can read, thanking you for your thoughts. And then this one, thank you for sharing the power of creative thought in the arts and how it has been used in music, poems, etc., to raise awareness about racial inequality in our nation and the effect it has had in the transformation of humanity. What profound role can the arts continue to play in the elimination of all forms of prejudice, especially being an artist and powerful actor yourself?
Well, again, I go back to that quote from Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, and his appointed successor, where he says, music is a ladder for the soul, so that it has the ability to lift us from one plane of existence to the other. I think implicit in that is this kind of there's this ability, this powerful ability for a kind of transformative experience through the mechanism of the arts, but accessing that ability, that capacity, is dependent on some significant first steps. I think one of those is intention. What is my intention through my engagement with the creative process? Why am I doing what it is that I'm doing? And if my intention is about, bringing some kind of nobility, about, foregrounding some kind of nobility, about foregrounding some dilemma that humanity is facing, but then also talking about the soul's aspiration for a kind of transcendence. It's a way out of that complexity. Then I might be, I think in that sense, I'm treading on the right path. And then after the intention, it's what am I sending into the world? I have the intention of creating something that will help advance our understanding as a human species. But what am I, between the intention and the manifestation of something physical, whether that be song or poetry or prose or a musical score or a visual art, what am I sending forth into the world? And does that material result correlate with what my intention is? So there's a lot of preliminary consideration that has to go into that process. And if the intention is aligned with the will of God, and I'm not saying that if you create something as an artist, as a creative, you don't have to be explicit about the work speaking about God. What I mean by that is you don't have to do, paintings about, about religious history, or there's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have to do that. If your inner life, for the most part, is aligned and attuned with the teachings of God and with your spiritual connectedness to the divine, then whatever it is that you manifest will reflect that. So I think it's that conscious intention, considering what it is that I'm sending forth into the world, making sure that I'm bringing myself to account each day, and making, and just being about the discipline, the commitment to creativity, and trusting that the spiritual connectedness that I've tried to cultivate in my life will send something forth into the world that is regenerative, that is restorative, that is constructive.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of our allotted time period here. So once again, thank you for that incredible, incredible presentation. We'd like to thank everyone for attending this morning's program. Next week, our speaker will be Ms. Nushin Agahi, and she will be discussing her documentary, A Struggle for Justice. We will now end with a short closing prayer. Thank you.
May I just wanted to thank everyone for giving me a little bit of your time. As I said yesterday to the friends, you could have spent your Sunday doing a number of things. There's a number of choices that you could have made. And I just want to thank you for committing and allowing me to take up just a little bit of your day and to just share what was on my heart. And I hope in some small sense it's been helpful. I know it's been helpful just to spend this time with you. It's been really helpful for me. And so I was just honored to spend this time with you all today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was outstanding speech.
So much, Mr. Olufani.
Yes.
Thank you again, and we hope that everyone will attend again next week, and that maybe we'll be able to schedule Mr. Olufani again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.